Hey, good afternoon. Yeah, thank you for your patience. I think we're at the college. This is going to be the starting point of this lecture. This is our second Women Library Book Club. We got our first one in November. And just so you know, like, regardless of the website and all of the trauma that's associated with that, from here on out until August, this event's going to be reoccurring. So I'm going to have a book club every third Saturday. So that's like you could just be set every third Saturday.
Same time?
Up until at least April, it's going to have the lecture component at 12, so exactly like this, and then at the book club part at 1:30. And I'm trying to work on getting lecture content for the post-April content of that, but I have all the books set up until July now. And just so you know, the next book, if it's not already on the website, is called Convenience Store Woman. It's a novella. It's like 120 pages. It's fiction. Really nice and easy, but really interesting.
Could you say that again?
It's called Convenience Store Woman. Yeah. Short, quick, interesting, a totally different perspective of things.
And it's in the bookshop.
And it is in the bookshop. I had it right there when you said. So please, go to the bookstore and get it that way. And look good for everyone involved in this. Me. Convenience Store Woman next February the 18th. And just if anyone hasn't made it to Ballinger Gallery for the Streets and Avenues install that is connected to the Women Library, please do so if you have a chance, because this is the last week. It's been up since April, and it's been extended since September, and it's finally going to close at the end of the month. And it was the thing that I curated, and I'm super proud of. That's going to be in that space. Then that space is going to close for a while, and when it reopens, it's going to be a retrospective of FOMA, the Friends of Mexican Art. That group is disbanding, but there's going to be a celebration of all the things that they've given to the museum over the last 50 years or so.
Do you know when that will be?
I do not know the opening date of that.
Or the month, or
It'll probably be like a month.
Wait, Jesse, it's February 21st is going to be an opening reception for FOMA itself, and then it'll be open after that.
Perfect. Kaylee had
I work here as well. So
They said they'll still remember.
Yeah, it's going to be super cool, and there's also going to be an element of the library in there, because we also run the archive, and our archivist is putting together sort of like an archival retrospective of documents from FOMA, like cool images, just stuff from the last 50 years, like ephemera.
I got to see a few of the pictures and things, and it really is wonderful to see that. So,
Yeah, it's going to be very, very cool. And then, just for anyone else's information, the library is going to have an event on Valentine's Day. There's going to be special hours because Valentine's falls on a Tuesday. And I think the museum is going to be open 12 to 7 that day on Tuesday the 14th. And the library is going to have a pop-up with Valentine's sort of materials like Reese books and ephemera in the Grand Hall between 4 and 6 that evening. So definitely check it out if you have the opportunity to do so.
The library is the only thing that's happening. Good thing you're here.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
And then, so finally we're going to kick this off. A warm welcome to our talker, or speaker, Dr. Deborah Deacon from Arizona State University, and she's a professor in the art history department. And she's going to give you a presentation about Manga 101 in Japanese popular culture.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it. I don't really need that. I'm going to talk today a little bit about anime, Japanese animated films, and manga, or graphic novels. For those of you, how many of you are coming to the book, or to the book? Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute, but just as a little background. I had the pleasure of living in Japan from 1980 to 1982, and knew nothing about Japan. I was in the Navy at the time. but I used to see all these men in suits, coats and ties on the buses or the trains, reading comic books. And I thought, okay, that's really weird. But that's okay. So fast forward a few decades, and I retired and went back to school, the ASU, to get a degree in art history. And I was interested in Asian art. I speak about this much Japanese anymore. I did learn a little while I lived there. But not to do East Asian art because I was not going to learn how to read all those characters at this point in my life. So I ended up bringing on Southeast Asia. But as I was looking for classes to put together and teach, my stepson was about 9 when Pokemon and his buddy Pikachu here came to town, and he was very interested, so I thought, well, I better figure out what this is. So I started paying attention to what he was working on and what he was watching. And then as he graduated into Gundam and all these flying giant robots, I thought, well, you know, this is pretty interesting. So Claudia Brown was my advisor. Those of you who know Claudia, she said, yeah, go ahead and do it and give it a try. And as they say, the rest is history. So here I am some 20 years later teaching classes on anime and manga at ASU, along with comic books and history of animation. So I've kind of switched to popular culture. So anyway, so that's kind of my background. So, anime, Japanese animated films. Manga, Japanese graphic novels, comic books, whatever you want to call them. Now I'm sure one of the first things you learn, for those of you who are reading our reading, is they don't open the way normal Western books do. And this book doesn't have it. But in many of them, they have a page that says, stop, you're reading the wrong way. And that's because Japanese is written right to left. So it's read right to left instead of left to right, the way we do. So in a lot of manga that you can buy, they just translate the verbiage in manga in English or French or whatever language it is. And so you open it the way we don't read. There are some, and I thought I actually grabbed it, but I guess I didn't. There are some that open the way we read, but to do that it's a lot more expensive to print because they have to flip all the images so you read the story in the right order. So these are two I just brought with me, so I thought you might like to look at them. Now, I used to say which came first, anime or manga, like a chicken and an egg, but now that we know dinosaurs laid eggs, that analogy's out the window. But anyway, pretty much anything that is available as a manga has been turned into an animated film in some form or another, either a series or a movie. The same is pretty much true for those that started out as animated films and then are converted into print. So I tend to use the terms interchangeably when I talk, so most of what I say is going to refer to both anime and manga. Okay, so manga. Katsuhiko Hokusai, the Great Wave of Kanaga, right, we all know, has been credited actually by Friedrich Schott, who was a German, who was one of the first academics who actually studied anime and manga, primarily in his case manga, in Japan in the 1980s. And he's the one who pretty much laid down in concrete, Hokusai is credited with inventing the term because he produced a series of 15 books, illustrated books of sketches, caricature studies. This is one from the Pacific Asia Museum collection in Pasadena that I got to use at an exhibition I did on anime 10 years ago or so. This one you can see, these are humorous drawings of samurai. And so, but there's been scholarship since Frederick Schott, particularly Adam Kern, who got his PhD at Yale, who came out and said, no, Teo Shigimasa actually was the first that we can tell who used this term to refer to caricature or humorous imagery. And he did it about, actually, maybe 15, 20 years before Hokusai used the term. So, all right. Now, in the creation of anime and manga, just to do a little quick and dirty, stories start out using storyboards. Somebody has an idea for a show. In this case, this is Hayao Miyazaki and some drawings from Spirited Away. So rather than writing out a whole big written detail of what it is, animators, either for manga or mangaka or the manga artists, draw storyboards. And they'll do a series of images to capture key scenes in a story. And they pitch that as their way to convince somebody to fund them to make their story into either print or film form. And then from there, each scene is reanimated again or re-storyboarded again. And in the case of anime, it's put onto anime cells, cellulose, just like in the good old days. I don't know, I'm sure you've all seen the Disney, and back in the day we could buy those in Wile E. Coyote. Cellulose, painted, and to make an average hour and a half animated movie, it takes more than 100,000 anime cells. Each individual movement is drawn first on paper like this. This is a duga, which tells the animators speeds, camera speeds, colors, what the characters look like. This is actually a series of them from Doraemon. This is, you're right, Sailor Moon, who many of you may know because it was very popular on television back in the 1990s, which was, I have to say, the first time I really encountered it with my daughter and didn't realize it was Japanese. But then I was telling you earlier, actually, as I started getting into my research on anime, I came to find out that, I know a lot more than I thought I did about anime, because when I was a kid, many of you, things like Astro Boy and Gigantor on TV, we just didn't know they were Japanese. We had no idea. So, Japanese animation has been around a long time. Here's my anime cell. This is a Gundam, one of the most popular giant robot sci-fi mecha. We call animation cell. These are getting harder and harder to find, just like Disney cells are getting. Actual film use cells are almost impossible because people are going to computer-generated imagery. Now in Japan, my understanding is an awful lot of them are still hand-drawn, but they're computer-colored. So they're put through, they're scanned into a computer and then colored from there. Except for Hayao Miyazaki, who's pulled out and still doing things by hand. On anime cells, there are two sides, a rough side and a smooth side. And typically, you lay down colors in a specific order, light to dark, just like in a woodblock print, which is where a lot of this tradition comes from, because you're going to look at it, you're laying the colors down on the back, so when you pick it up, you need to be able to see all of the colors. So in this case, actually the black lines were laid down first, most likely, the outline, and then they're colored in layer by layer, just like in a woodblock print. All right, so genres. Anime and manga come in pretty much any genre you can think of, just like film. So we have action, adventure stories, think Indiana Jones in our, in the West. Science fiction of all kinds. I separated out NECA, giant flying robots, as a whole separate institution. Romance, comedy, horror. I just heard that my nephew sent me an email this morning about some new anime that's going to be released this year. And Junicho Ito's horror films, horror novels are being animated right now. I forget if it's in Netflix or I think it's on Netflix. I'm not a horror person, so I will not be watching those, but a lot of my students will. What are you going to answer?
Isn't there a film that's nominated, that's an anime, for the?
Academy Awards?
Yeah.
I don't know, because I'm sure there is. There's usually, I mean, Spirited Away won an Academy Award many years ago. It was the first anime that won an Academy Award. Yeah. I haven't looked to see what's, Julia, I hate to say it, I have no idea what's nominated.
Pinocchio.
Oh, the new Pinocchio movie by Benicio del Toro. Yeah. Yeah, which is not anime, it's animation. Okay, our slice of life, scenes from every day, like school kid stories. I didn't put sports up there. Basketball stories, golf stories, baseball stories.
Would our book that for book club be Slice of Life?
This one is probably food, and I put food up there, and I thought it was,
Yeah.
I thought, that's really stupid, because inevitably there are several,
So there's a genre for food.
there is a genre for food.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I would put it under slice of life too. And that's why I always kind of laugh when I have students in my classes who say, I'm gonna move to Japan and do anime. And I'm like, yeah, no, you're not. It's a nice idea, and you probably don't speak Japanese, first problem. And second problem, all of these animes that everybody loves are very animated, are very Japanese. They are aimed at a Japanese audience. They are created for a Japanese audience. So they have things like food, or Manani Neko, the little cat with the, arm that goes like this, or any number of other aspects, taking your shoes off when you come to the door, tatami mats, whatever, that you don't know. And for them, it's just part of everyday life. But we in the West aren't familiar with that, unless we've lived there for a long time. So, and you see a lot of that in Slice of Life.
What's the last one?
Mecha? It's giant robots. I could do a whole hour and a half on giant robot stories, which I will not do. Although I did bring this is actually a Transformer, which is a joint Japanese-American production, originally as an animated film in the early 1970s. That looks very different from the live-action Transformer series that's happening in the last 10 or 15 years. So he actually converts, but it's these giant robots, which we can talk about a little bit.
Is there an Academy Awards for Japanese in Japan? No.
Oh, yes, there are major film awards ceremonies in Japan. The last few years, live-action Japanese films have not fared well at Japanese film festivals. It's usually the top grossing films in Japan in the last 8-10 years have been animated. And that reminds me, I should say before, while we're doing genres, I didn't put kids films up here, but we'll talk about them a little. Please understand, how many of you have children or grandchildren, or you love anime, right? Trust me when I say not all anime and manga is meant for little kids. Yeah. There are some very adult stories, and we'll talk about a few. And I used to, I stopped doing it now, but when I would go through Barnes & Noble or Borders or whatever, and go to the anime section or manga section, and I look at little kids and what they're reading, and I would do things like, does your mother know what you're reading? Because there are some very adult-oriented, not necessarily pornographic, but adult-themed shows that are not appropriate for kids. All right. So we already mentioned a little bit Sailor Moon and Pikachu here from Pokemon. Probably the two most famous anime and manga that introduced American kids to Japanese animation. Sailor Moon, like I said, in the early 90s, Pokemon in the late 90s, early 2000s, and that's Pikachu. All right, so there are several styles of anime and manga, and many of them, most of them have roots in traditional Japanese art. So this is a scene, painted scene from Tale of Genji. How many of you know Genji, the novel, 1,100-page novel by Yorosaki Shikibu, written in the year 1000, the first real novel ever written in the world. The story of the illegitimate son of the emperor, Genji, and his romp through life. Soap operas have nothing on Genji. Genji is a ladies' man. Anyway, throughout history, Genji and other stories like this have been illustrated, typically with one image at the beginning of each chapter of a book or a scroll. This is one from the 14th century, and it features beautiful women in beautiful clothing in a palace. And you can see, here one's having her hair combed, one is reading, they're behind different screens, and this is a bird's eye view from common blown away roof view. We're looking down on a scene, calm, quiet, but if you look at it, it's also kind of on an angle. So things are not as they seem. Maybe it's not as peaceful and calm as we think. We call this, from the Heian era, part of Yamato-e or native Japanese style paintings. We call this ona-e, or women's pictures. Now, I maintain, and I will give myself credit for being the first person who has actually said this, writing in academia, that this is a direct ancestor of shoujo, or girls' stories. Girls' stories that include beautiful girls. This is from Magic Knight Rayer, a story where three young girls who are in junior high getting ready to, they're going to have to separate because they're going to go to different schools, and they're standing around bemoaning this separation, and one of them says, "If only there was a way we could stay together." And as in most of these anime, the earth opens, a giant bad guy shows up, and they find themselves falling, and maybe in an Alice in Wonderland type story, into a strange world that they called Saphira, that they now have to protect from evil. So anyway, so we have beautiful women, beautiful clothing, lots of swirling lines, just like in Ona-e. But there's one thing that's a little different here, and that is the use of girl power. These young women, there's a guy in background. These are young women who have to figure things out for themselves. They have to learn to work together as a team, and they don't need the knight in shining armor coming in to save them. They're going to save themselves. Yes?
Why are the eyes oversized and emphasized?
We'll get to that in a few minutes. No, that's a good question. We'll get to that as soon as we, in a couple minutes, a couple slides. So, shoujo, girls' stories. Usually a lot of love and romance. They're often magical girls, so they have magical powers. There's no cat in this, but they have friends, animal friends. Sailor Moon has a little black cat. Now, in addition to ona-e, there is otoko-e in Japanese, Yamato-e, or traditional Japanese painting, or men's pictures. Now these tend to be no verbiage. I said, the Tale of Genji, yes, was illustrating a novel. These are pretty much standalone pieces. This is the Tale of the Flying Granary, which is a Buddhist story of the monk Myoren, who in fact himself was magic, who lived on a mountaintop, and he sent his magic flying bowl, which you can see up here, his alms bowl, down to the house of a very wealthy merchant, looking for a donation, for food, as a way for the Japanese to make merry. Well, the bowl sat around and nobody paid it any attention, and it finally got aggravated. So, it stole the granary with all the rice in it. And all of a sudden now we have all the people who worked for the rich merchant chasing after it, trying to get their food back. But this is a standalone piece. There's no verbiage associated with this. It's an action-filled image. Doesn't have a lot of color in it. So, a lot of emphasis on action, not much talk. Typically not much magic either. Oh. Uh-oh, I left out a slide. How did I do that? All right, well, all right. So, anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, there's a men or boys story equivalent to this called shonen, S-H-O-N-E-N, boys stories. Typically, those are, well, I would say Rurouni Kenshin, which is going around, is somewhat, even though it is a samurai story. So these are boys stories, samurai, you could call all the mecha and sci-fi, lots of action, lots of adventure, not much talking, a lot of grunting, a lot of one-word answers, a lot of onomatopoeia or sounds, but not a whole lot of chit-chat like the girls. All right, so, yes?
When did those all start, the girl stories and the boy stories?
Talk about that right now. Well, the girls, the idea of the Japanese, the girl stories, okay. They pretty much started, you can start the actual manga to pre-war Japan, and then, but mostly post-war Japan. These kinds of comic stories were put out in periodicals. Just like in Victorian London, you would get serials, exactly, by Chaucer, well, not Chaucer, but, Dickens, thank you, couldn't Charles. Dickens, right out of my head. Where you'd have to buy a magazine every month to get the next chapter. This same thing happened, especially after World War II. These were very inexpensive ephemera. They could be rented in a convenience store, and then returned, but most likely people bought them for essentially pennies, and they'd pass them around to all their friends, and then they get thrown away. So that all started, but the reality is, it goes back to shortly after the Heian era, where you started having the Tale of Issei, you have Genji, you have these illustrated stories for women, which were teaching women how to act properly in public. And then there were yellow comics from about the 18th and 19th century that were a little more risque, because they featured a lot of geisha. Yeah.
Which one is the one about teaching women how to dress and?
That's the same, that's exactly it. They're based on, Tale of Issei is one, but that's also a war story too. But they talked about proper Confucian etiquette for women. You know your place kind of thing. You're behind the screen, you can never interact with a man unless it's your father, your brother, or your husband, in person, face to face. In Genji, there's a lot of that in Genji where they have to sit behind screens and talk to each other. So all that actually it's kind of an evolution. But really what we think of as manga today starts right before World War II through the war period and even to today. Yeah.
Is it tied to the increase in literacy rates in Japan? Because I would expect the ones that are very tutorial, there was a very low literacy rate, there was something.
Yeah, they're I don't know, yeah, to literacy, most of this stuff is upper class, maybe some merchant class, but it's not the peasant out from the white field who's got access to this, because they're not. Yeah, that part of it, it's tied to the Meiji Emperor and his fixation in 1868 through 1885 through 1912, where he wants to westernize Japan and make it a modern country, so he brings in Western scientists, Western artists to teach Western style scientific drawing, which of course brings in all kinds of other stuff that they didn't really want, but they got anyway. And this idea of Western armament, so you have the Russo-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War, that's all tied together in this modernization, the import of, all of a sudden the emperor's wearing Western and his wife are wearing Western style clothes in the late 19th, early 20th century. So it all kind of comes together. Yeah. Okay, so animation, by the way, actually in Japan starts about 1907. We have in the late 19th and early 20th century, like in much of the world, we have lantern slides where there are paintings on glass and they're projected onto a screen of some kind with a candle, images, and you have a kameshibai or storytelling. Kameshibai also, actually still in Japan today in some places, on a bicycle, has a little stage on the back of his bicycle with wooden stage with painted imagery, and he tells a story on a street corner. This is all part of this narrative that leads up to really a Western style animation tradition, which starts with the Lumiere brothers in France in the late 19th century, who introduced the idea of moving pictures around the world. They're the ones who really started all that. And Japan, up to and through the war, and I'm just going to be this short with this one, did have a thriving animation industry, which the U.S. shut down after the occupation because all of their famous animation characters fought for Japan during the war, so they were banned after the war. Momotaro, the Magic Peach Boy, is one. Norakuru, who's a dog who kind of looks like Goofy, big item morphed dog. He kind of got to come back in the late 70s for a little while, but otherwise he's been kind of banished. Anyway, but fast forward to the late 1940s, early 1950s in American occupied Japan, and we see the influx of Western style comics and Western style animation in Japan. And one of the people in the audience who's paying very close attention is Osamu Tezuka, the person called the godfather of manga, although he did a lot of animation too. Now, Tezuka, as a boy, was very sickly, but he drew. His mother encouraged his imagination. And he wanted to be a doctor, so he went to medical school. He put himself through college and medical school by publishing his own manga, 100,000 copies, of The New Treasure Island, which is a retelling of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island with animals. And when he graduated from medical school, he never practiced, because by the time he got out of medical school, he had such a big manga industry that he couldn't give it up. Now, some of Tezuka's influences included Walt Disney. It's said that he watched Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs more than 50 times in the theater, sitting sketching in the dark. If you think of that, this is the first full-length color feature animated film. And Disney created new kinds of cameras. He imported live animals, and he had a woman come in and dance so that the animators could sketch the motion and could capture realistic motion. Long ago, I was very fortunate enough to do an exhibition of objects from Papua New Guinea that were collected by Mark Davis. Mark was one of Disney's 9 old men, and his wife Alice costumed It's a Small World and the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion and other things. And she talked about this in Mark's experience with dealing with live actors to learn how to do this. So he drew his influences from that. But he also drew his influences from Max Fleischer, Fleischer Brothers Studio, and Betty Boop. We all know Betty, right? Well, if you look at Betty, she's got those big round eyes you were asking me about. She's got that little bitty waist. She's got those big boobs, long legs, and that crazy hairdo. And Tezuka adopted that and into his own iconography. And the iconography for the female form in anime, which is still used today, comes from old Princess Sapphire here from the anime and manga Princess Knight. The story of a young girl who's born into the king and queen of a kingdom, but she's their only child, but she can't inherit the kingdom because she's a girl. So they raise her as a boy. Her hair is short, she's got wears the little tights and the little chemise thing here. She learns how to ride a horse. She's really good with a sword. She's a guy. Until she falls in love with the captain of the horse brigade, and then it's kind of jukes out. Yeah. And it's interesting because at the same time, Rose of Versailles was a very popular manga about the court of Marie Antoinette, where a young girl is raised by her parents as a boy, and she becomes a captain of the guard. And there's a movie, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, a live-action movie, French movie, and the same thing happens. So, yeah.
Where did that concept of sort of girl power, right? Because there was really no girl power anywhere in any country.
Right, and especially in Japan, there was not. But
There were female samurai.
there were female samurai,
In history.
but
This is a huge move
Right.
here with the girl power.
this is all kind of that Western influences coming in. It's also imagination. It's some of the stories, because especially back in the Heian era, you're right, Ramachi, Momoyama, there are samurai, but they didn't run around in the countryside on horses working for the daimyo. You know, they had their place, but they were samurai. They had a code of honor. So all of this is kind of coming together, coupled with the idea of the 1950s. If you think about what's going on in mid-century modern, you've got the space race starting to happen. You've got reimaginings of culture and what is the future going to look like. In this case, it's also coming out of Western fairy tales, because all this stuff is flooding into Japan. All this Western learning is coming in. And so it's being synthesized by men mostly, although there are quite a few women animators and manga artists in the 50s who are inventing stories and looking for power for themselves. So it's kind of this magical, but it's kind of like saying, you've got in the 20s and 30s and 40s women in the West getting the right to vote and increasing their visibility and their possibilities. The same thing is happening. The other thing that happens is during World War II, like in the West, maybe not as many women, but women start to do non-traditional jobs. And as soon as the war happens, they're shut down and they go back in the house. So this whole idea of, ooh, we almost had it. What do we think it's gonna be like in the future?
Sorry, what was the name of this?
Oh, this is Princess Night,
And this
is
is
the
what
name of
year?
the story. 1967, I think.
Okay.
I can
Thank
remember
you.
off the top of my head. But it's fairly early. Some of Tezuka's other works include a telling of the story of the Buddha in 8 hardback volumes that take about as much space on my shelf. And I always laugh at this because he's a South Asian prince. I think he looks like a Mesoamerican. I think these characters look very Mesoamerican. But that's okay, that's just me. The story of the life of the Buddha and his trials. One of my favorites, Kimba the White Lion, the story of a small orphaned lion cub who, with his band of merry followers, his girlfriend Nala, a parrot, we have an antelope, we have a mandrill, are in the jungle saving the animals. Now in this case, one of the evil characters is his uncle, the grown-up lion with a big scar down his face, who has a band of hyenas, who are his minions.
Does that sound familiar? or-
Right, does this sound familiar? Now, understood this is 1965. Okay, oh yeah. Also, Kimba, who is allowed to grow up, although the ones that were shown in the U.S., they never showed him as a grown lion. He also saves the jungle animals from the evil black and white hunters. So there's a lot of rescue going on. When The Lion King came out, online, all the anime fans were like, frame by frame. Oh look, here's Kimba being held up by Daddy on top of a cliff. Oh, and look at here from The Lion King. And oh look, Daddy's in the cloud. There's a lot of, you can still find that stuff online. Well, Disney came out and said, oh, we have no idea who Tezuka is. Until the pictures of Tezuka meeting Walt Disney at the 1964 World's Fair showed up. And it turns out Tezuka really adored Disney. And they met at the 64 World's Fair, which is the one that gave us It's a Small World, among other things. Tezuka's family, because he was dead by then, came out and said, oh, he would be so honored to know that Disney did an homage to his work. And that was kind of the end of that. So, the evil empire at work, is what I said. All right, so Astro Boy is probably Tezuka's most famous character. Based on Collotto's Pinocchio fairy tale from the 19th century, the story of, in this case, a young robot crafted by a scientist who's lost his son, and he does good work. He's got rockets in his feet and a special atomically powered heart. And like Pinocchio, he has a lot of the same adventures in his mangas. He ends up becoming a donkey at one point. He gets abducted into a circus. He goes into the whale. But anyway, he evolves over time. So he's been around for a long, long time now. And it's probably one of the earliest that I remember from American TV in the 60s. All right, some other popular speed racer, which none of us knew, again, was anime, yes?
Oh, no, I'm returning to, I remember Speed Racer Johnny Quest.
Exactly, well, Johnny Quest was American. This one is not. This one, but again, what they did in American TV with all of these is they kind of edited out the little Japanese parts. So you really didn't see them eating chopsticks. You didn't get that understanding that this was. And part of that is because American TV was trying to fit it into their time slots. No, it came out as Speed Racer. You just didn't know Trixie you know, who was a girl in the 60s flying a helicopter, by the way, which was pretty cool. You know, you didn't see her eat lunch, or you didn't realize they were driving on the other side of the road, kind of thing. They flipped the film, so you couldn't tell they were driving on the left instead of the right. Magic Art Grey Earth, which I talked about and passed around. And of course, Sailor Moon, the original magical girls, who worry about if they have a date on Saturday and what they're going to wear while they're out saving the world from an invasion, from an alien invasion somewhere. Again, beautiful people, beautiful clothes, magic, and girl power. And they talk about girl power. Now there's all kinds of animators. Tezuka started his own studio and animated an awful lot of different interesting old films. Probably the most famous animator in Japan is Hayao Miyazaki, called the godfather of anime, although he also did mangas. So it's pretty, I was going to say, talk about it. Miyazaki, unlike Tezuka, knew he wanted to be an artist from the time he was little. He comes from a very wealthy family. Miyazaki Motors makes airplane engines, among other things. But he went to school specifically to study, he studied political science and he studied art. And when he got out of school, he went to work for Toei Animation Company as an in-betweener. An in-betweener is the person who draws all of these, all of the action, individual, page by page, between the first opening cell that opens a scene and the last cell. So that can be 100 images, and it's each motion. He was very successful, and his abilities were quickly recognized, and he had a chance to start directing. He did a couple of TV shows, and quickly branched out to full-length feature films. His first one was Castle of Cagliostro, based on a manga by Monkey Punch, which is based on the French gentleman thief Arsène Lupin, 19th century. You know, a gentleman thief, kind of think Cary Grant and Catch a Thief, you know, suave. Oh, but he's not quite so suave. It's comic. And very cute. So, but he went along to do Princess Mononoke, the story of Iron Age culture in flux, where you have the magic of the forest and the old gods competing with man and his expansion into the spirit realm, the magical realm. Spirited Away, which won an Academy of the first Japanese anime, or first animated film to win an Oscar for, and the story of a young girl who goes into a magical world, kind of an Alice in Wonderland story again, goes to this tunnel into the spirit world, and ends up having to work in a bathhouse because her parents pigged out the gods who were literally turned pigs. So there's a little bit of the Odyssey in there. And a really interesting story that many Americans have a hard time with because they don't understand who all the gods are. But it's still worth watching. My personal favorite, My Neighbor Totoro. Again, kind of a magical world where two young girls moved out of the city because their mother's in the hospital, and they explore the magic world, again based on Alice in Wonderland. In this case, little May here falls down a hole under a tree and encounters Totoro. I brought my little Totoro, I didn't bring the big Totoro with me. He's big Totoro, but I brought the small version. And it's a really sweet story. Kurosawa has this on his list of the best top 50 films ever made. So I recommend that. And then The Wind Rises, it's from a textbook, a book But it was Miyazaki's last movie, but he was back. He retired, but he's back, so it's not his last movie. But essentially the story of a young man who, an aircraft designer, who finds his aircraft is put to use that he didn't intend during World War II, and how he deals with that. Very sweet story, very, very nice story. Nothing wrong with it, but probably not something a young child would find, because it moves kind of slowly compared to other films.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is something like Totoro, when you mentioned it, it's similar to Alice in Wonderland?
Yeah.
So is that like just an accepted thing, or is that more like The Lion King, like? Hey,
No, it's what it is, because it's not, I mean, The Lion King and King of the White Lion are pretty much the same story.
Mm.
This is that idea of a young girl. Most of Miyazaki's characters are young girls, because he thinks children are very innocent, close to nature, which is a big, the environment is a big theme for him, as is aviation and the traditional Japanese, the gods and Shinto are very important. And he's afraid that in this globalization, kids are losing their traditions. But when I say I did work on anime, influences. And Alice in Wonderland, this idea of a girl who goes through some kind of a liminal experience and encounters a magical, wondrous world where things maybe are very different from real life, just like Alice does with, So it's that idea of the transformation and the wonderment that they experience. They're strange creatures. There is Clamp, which is an all-girl group in Osaka, did a story called Yuki-chan in Wonderland, which is definitely not for children. But it's a pretty direct borrow. But all the characters are like drag queens and dominatrixes. So it's a little wilder. It's not for everyone. That's a direct, but it's Yuki-chan in Wonderland, so you know. So no, that's just kind of, there's other examples in the West. I mean, you would say The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is an Alice, influenced story too. So it's a little less cool. So there is anime for kids that I would recommend. Ponyo, Hayao Miyazaki's kind of his twist on The Little Mermaid, maybe, except she starts out as goldfish. And it's wonderful. The illustration in this is just amazing. The colors. Pokemon, and so Pikachu and Ash. I just saw something today that after 26 years, Ash, boy, on the right, is being retired, and they're bringing out a new group of Pokemon trainers. This is the last year for Ash. 26 years, it can't be that long, but it is. And then on the right, one of my personal favorites, Hamtaro, the story of little hamsters who have adventures when their owner goes off to school every day. It's really cute, really cute. They have a lot of fun. Those are good kids' stories. All right. So, but there are stories that are for adults, no offense here, but we're just talking about this. That they're not pornographic, so I'm not saying. These are stories that really have thoughtful ideas. Well, I'll start with that. 1988, the first anime that really introduced the West to this idea of animation, and Japanese animation. If you watch it today, it looks like it was done today. It's really aged well. There's one scene where he's on a motorcycle, does a spin that I had a student send me a link with. It must have had 50 animated films where they were doing that same homage to Acura. So it was really kind of cool. Post-apocalyptic Tokyo, and kind of tough world, as we imagine post-apocalyptic worlds, but a fabulous story that I highly recommend it. Millennium Actress, animator. Satoshi Kon unfortunately died 10 years ago now from pancreatic cancer, and he only did 5 or 6 movies. Millennium actress tells the story of a life of a retired actress and she's being interviewed by a newspaper man, and she tells her life story through her film rolls. And you forget you're watching an animated film for this movie. It is spectacular. And all of his works are. How many of you know the movie Inception? Well, Paprika came first, as a book, Japanese book, oh, by the way. And then Satoshi Kon did an animated version of the same idea where you have something implanted in your head that messes with your perspective on reality, shall we say. Fascinating. Ghost in the Shell.
Movie at that.
There's all kinds, yes. Yes, Scarlett Johansson. There are several movies, there are several mangas. The story kind of what does it mean to be human? Because you have this implanting of human anatomy into the shell of a body. You have all these cybernetic enhancements. Plus there's an undercurrent of terrorism and, shall we say, invasion of the internet by terrorists and potential repercussions for that. So yes, the movie with Scarlett Johansson, I actually thought was fine. People were all upset because, oh, they're not Japanese. Well, none of these characters, particularly even in their drawn form, look particularly Japanese people. You know, get over it. So, and then Neon Genesis Evangelion, giant mecha, the idea of the Earth is being invaded by aliens, and Japan through has to rise again and fight and save the Earth from these. And they do it using, I didn't bring my Ava, the giant robot called Avas, piloted by teenagers, I would say. Pilots who were born after the Earth was devastated, and they merged with the machine. It was designed to be the last word in giant robots, but it spawned a whole other decade or two. It was a TV series. I think there's 8 DVDs. They did a film to end the series, which the fans hated. So they did another film to end the series, which the fans hated. So they did another film, which everybody finally liked. Yes?
I have a question about the hairstyle.
Yeah.
They all look like bad wigs.
Well,
And it's the same thing in the booklet too, in that raggedy look on the hair.
it's just the hairdos. The different colors, hair, which is always something stupid people ask about, helps you differentiate, and the hairdos help you differentiate characters, because remember, if you're looking through the books, everybody's in black and white. So you have to find a way to differentiate the characters, or they all look alike after a while. So the hair color helps in animation, and then the different hairstyles help as well. All right. So, what does all this have to do with what's out in the gallery, with the Mr. Show? Obviously, has been strongly influenced, which he says, by shoujo, or girls, animation, and manga, the characters, with the big eyes, the short skirts, which are usually school uniforms that the girls wear, like British sailor suits from the 19th century, magical girls with their pets, their friends, and then of course he's adding in the layer of consumerism and this overload from modernity between the video games and phones and blinking neon lights. But his work is very definitely rooted in contemporary or pop culture in the forms of anime and manga, which are now global, had happened for a while, global That's all I have. Long time, sorry.
A couple of things. One, where does Barefoot Again fit into?
Okay, Barefoot Again is a really important work. The artist, not I'm just wondering, I'm getting old. The artist was a 5-year-old living in Hiroshima when the bomb went off. He happened to be on his way to school and was behind a brick wall when the bomb went off. So he was relatively unscathed. He lost some of his family members. His mother eventually died of radiation poisoning. And he grew up as a peace advocate. He created this story, Barefoot Again, which I have a comic book that's used in American schools. And then he did a manga series and an anime series about his experience as a child. The idea of, how do you survive? What about the injuries? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? It is well worth watching. It's very difficult to watch. There's a series of atomic bomb survivors literature out there, which I guess most of those are now dying off because of their ages. He died fairly young. I think he was 74, 75 when he died, ultimately of the longer term effects of being exposed to radiation. There's Grave of the Fireflies by Studio Ghibli, which tells the story of 2 children in Kobe who have to fend for themselves when their aunt kicks them out. Kobe gets bombed, but firebombed, not nuclear bombed. Beautifully done work, but keep your Kleenex close. That's all I can say. Yeah.
So how are you getting access to watching these as just a normal
Well,
person?
there's Crunchyroll, which is a website. You can buy, Target sells a lot of this stuff.
But you could, like Netflix
Netflix,
doesn't have
oh no, Netflix is doing a lot of their own
They
anime.
do.
Yes, Netflix, Prime. Nowadays, they're all over the place. Back in the day, you just go on Amazon and buy them too. I mean, I have like hundreds of these.
And Bookman's carries anything?
Bookman's will, yes, Bookman's does have both manga and anime, and they're usually used, so they're a little less expensive. Yeah. Your local library probably has a lot of them also, but you can just check it out.
Do they have mangas in color?
No, mangas, well, I shouldn't say that, because Nostra Valley of the Wind is done in color, and there are a couple others. Most of them are done in black and white. So the use of line when I'm talking class. Line is important for expression. Unlike American comics, when they are printed in Japanese, they're on a higher quality paper than Superman, that I remember as a kid. So just that.
You spoke about beautiful women, which made me think of woodblock prints and that whole genre. So could this have the women come out of that?
Yes, although most of those women are geisha, you're talking ukiyo-e, yes. They're beautiful women in beautiful clothing, absolutely. It's kind of when I teach this, we talk about this whole evolution, we talk about the whole woodblock print tradition with the books and Kobe. It's all part of an evolution. Kind of like comic books are coming out of novels in the West. I mean, today you can buy Jane Eyre as a graphic novel. You can buy Dickens as a graphic novel form too. So it's kind of, it's a nice way to get non-readers to read. Yeah. It's just a way to.
Is JoJo part of this whole animation thing?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes. Although I don't know that I've ever even watched JoJo. One of my students watch it, I don't know that that's one. And I always tell people, I'm not otaku, I do not know the life story of every character in the anime, nor do I want to. Thank you very much, people.
You talked about the eyes, you know, and why that's the case. What about skin tone? Why isn't there much of a difference in different skin
Because
tones?
Japan is a fairly homogeneous society. And there's not, I mean, there are darker skinned Japanese and lighter skinned Japanese, but Chinese, Korean, Japanese, skin tones are fairly even. Now, he has, in his pictures, he has characters who are different skin tones. And some of that does come from some more modern stories. I think, if I think about it, I think Pokemon has not all Japanese characters as trainers, so.
I will note on that the,
Hi, so good to see you.
the original person on the that
Yep.
based on you might have read is African American.
No, Max Fleischer is not African.
No, not no, I said the person.
Oh, the
on
person
whom Betty, who you can start, that came
Carol
up more
Kane?
recently with some of the, different.
She was
that's-
the voice. She was the voice.
No, not in terms of the acting, but the actual person. Who
And
is-
that reread my Max Fleischer biography.
Yes. Esther, I'm sorry, she
I'll have to go back to do my novel, like my biography I have. I don't remember that, but okay, thank you. That's good to know. Yes.
Yeah, Josephine.
If any, might be the relationship between these big-eyed girls. And in the, I think maybe it was in the 70s or so, there was an American woman.
Yeah,
between
Why
the
Came,
big
yes.
white- Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any connection there? I can see now today that these came first, but might there have been?
I would say her inspiration probably came more from Max Fleischer than from anime, because when she was painting in the 70s, anime was pretty low key in America. It wasn't, you know, a lot of the characters looked more normal, what we would say normal, didn't have this. It's just as Sailor Moon became popular.
She was in Hawaii, would they have gotten things there? That would have been-
I don't know that. Potentially, yes. I mean, I had students here who were doing anime, if we call it Japanimation, in the early 80s. There was a Japanimation club here in Phoenix. So, that I honestly don't know, but I've never seen anything that said, I can't think of what her name is.
Margaret somebody.
Yeah, it started with an S, I think. But I don't know that I ever saw that was an influence on her.
I looked it up and it says Esther Lee, baby Esther Jones, a black Chicago woman, a well-known singer of the 1920s, is the initial inspiration. for
Okay,
the
can you
American
repeat that?
Betty
Okay.
Boop. If you look up Max Fleischer, Betty Boop, this will just come up and this is on one of
Okay.
the drop downs, they'll say
Thank
what
you.
race is Betty Boop.
I didn't know that, thank you very much. Okay, all right.
I just have one other question. It's, you know, it was very interesting that you said, I hadn't realized that that girls are often used for their innocence, where I think sometimes, maybe with this exhibit, through our Western eyes, we actually think there's something sordid about a grown man continuing to.
Well, I won't say it's just with this exhibit, because there's a movie called Otaku no Video that is supposedly the history of, it's an anime, part anime, part live action, that supposedly tells the story of the founding of Gainax, one of the main animation studios. And in there, and I almost put the slide in, I decided not to, you see a kind of an overweight guy with big glasses as an otaku or fan, which was a derogatory term referencing nerds in not a good way. But in the film they talk about that otaku like their women buxom, blonde, and plastic and 6 inches tall, a reference to the anime figures. In other words, they're afraid of real women. But they call that a Lolita complex, like novel, and there's a lot of that. In anime, there's a lot of more innocent, shower scenes where you don't really see anything, but the girl's supposed to be naked. And the guy's got either a piece of snot coming out of his nose or he's sweating, which are cues about how they're uncomfortable or excited. The really short sailor uniforms. Yeah, there is, and his work has a lot of actual more sexuality assigned to it, not the works that are just like here.
Well, there's a whole Lolita.
Right,
stream.
right. And we had the ACI had a woman come in and talk about costume, not cosplay, costuming. And so that's a whole nother thing. In fact, when I heard about this, I kind of went, this is going to be interesting. How's this going to play? But, they picked nice. So, he's an adult. Anyway, thank you all very much.